Hi, I'm Steve Gill. Welcome in for another edition of Tennessee Star Campaign 2018 with a very special guest today, Congresswoman Marsha Blackburn, who wants to elevate that title to Senator Marsha Blackburn. She's here with us today, and good to be with you. We've been friends for a long time.
Very long time.
It's kind of interesting to do one of these where there's not the horn honking going on behind us. We can actually hear each other.
I tell you, we can, because your participation in stopping that state income tax and coming down and rallying the troops and getting people out, it was so vital. You and Phil Valentine and a lot of good fond memories and actually great stories for people that want to talk to their children about civic involvement. And I have to tell you, Steve, I love it when I'm around the state and people come up to me and they will say, "Hey Marsha, I was a horn honker," or "Hey Marsha, I was only 8 years old, but I was out there." And
I've actually got a great picture of us doing an interview, and my sons Patrick and Ryan were literally about 4 and 5 years old, standing behind us, who are now like 24 and 26 years old. So literally kids have grown up who were there that day, and some of them are starting to get into politics. I guess it's our fault. We got them.
I think it is our fault because they may have been pulled along in the little red wagon out there, or they were circling, honking the horn.
That was Tea Party before there was a Tea Party.
You know, it really was. And you think about all the tea bags that people would mail to our offices and say, oppose this state income tax. But it really was, I think, what was the genesis of this conservative revolution, if you will, in our state, in our country. That is the cause for people saying, let's give government back to the people and be a government of, by, and for the people. And of course, that participation in stopping that state income tax and then putting our state on a different path has paid enormous dividends. You can look at the business climate in the state, you can look at the jobs growth, you can look at the number of cranes that are scattered around in towns and cities in Tennessee, and you know that economic vitality is here because we're a great place to do business, low regulation, low taxation, business-friendly environment. One
of the first things you did when you went to Washington, we're going to talk a little background in a moment, but one of the first things you did when you went to Washington as a member of Congress was to try and take that tax fight right to Washington, and as a freshman, were able to get a cut, or at least get Tennesseans to be able to deduct our sales tax in Tennessee. Before that, you could deduct your state income tax if you were in a state that paid that, but the states like Tennessee and Texas and Florida and others that had a sales tax and no income tax, we didn't get to deduct it. One of the first things you did as a freshman was pass a bill that allowed us to get that same deduction.
That's right. It actually was legislation that affected 60 million Americans and everybody in the state of Tennessee. But when we were fighting the state income tax, those that were pushing, and this was bipartisan support for a state income tax and bipartisan opposition. There were a lot of Democrats around the state that came out and helped me with that fight. But one thing people would say was, well, you'd be able to deduct the sales tax you pay every year from your federal income tax filing. So, being someone who grew up in sales and marketing, I said, let's take that objection away. And let's get parity and fair treatment so that Tennesseans can deduct the sales tax they pay every year. So you have that line on your federal income tax filing, your 1040 form now, where you can choose to deduct the sales tax you pay, or if you don't itemize, you can take a standard deduction. And that Lieutenant Governor John Wilder, the late Lieutenant Governor Wilder, would call me and say, Marsha, that's worth $1 billion a year to the pockets of Tennessee taxpayers. And that's the reason that I did it, was to give you more control over your paycheck and to lower your tax burden. And I really saw it as a fairness issue for those of us in states like Tennessee and Texas and Florida, Nevada, that don't have a state income tax.
One of the successes of the Trump administration thus far that you were in the middle of was cutting taxes. We're already seeing the benefits of it, even though the tax cuts themselves actually don't even go into effect next year. But that optimism, the fact that companies have been able to bring back some money, the fact that they've been able to pay out some bonuses, has already bumped the economy. Today we learned that the GDP for the quarter is 4.1%. People were scoffing not that long ago when Donald Trump was talking about that level of GDP, that, oh, we'll never get there, we can't get there. Did the tax cuts already play into that, or is that benefit still yet to come?
I think that it does play into it. And one of the things that so many Tennesseans mentioned to me when they filled out their income tax this year, what the tax preparer would do is show them what effect the Trump tax cuts would have for next year's filing. So they went into this year knowing what that effect was going to be. They've gotten wage increases, salary increases, employees have increased benefits. All of this helps people to be more optimistic and positive about their economic future.
And this included the tax cuts passed because of the overwhelming support of the Democrats that provided, 0 votes for the tax cuts.
Right.
They didn't assist at all. So this is a Republican Trump tax cut.
That's right. There was not one single Democrat in either the House or the Senate that voted for the Trump tax cuts.
Even the senators in those Trump-won red states that are places where Joe Donnelly and Claire McCaskill and Joe Manchin and others are competing, not a single one of them who claim to be different kind of Democrats voted for the tax cut.
That's right, not a one of them. And indeed, Phil Bredesen, who's my opponent, had said he would have voted no, and he called them crumbs. And what we are seeing is that averaging about $1,700 per family in Tennessee is not crumbs. That is a family vacation, it is camp fees for summer camps, it is back to school fees for children that are going to school. It is the opportunity to go and watch a Preds game or Titans games or UT football games or so many different things. That is extra money in their pocket.
And when you look at this Senate race that you're in the midst of, what we hear from Phil Bredesen is that he's going to be a different kind of Democrat, but you don't see different kind of Democrats in the Senate. And when we look at what Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi are saying, Chuck Schumer has recruited Phil Bredesen into this race. They want to raise taxes if they get back control of the Senate and the House. Well,
they've said that one of the first things they're going to do is repeal the Trump tax cuts. And when you look at my race, I think it's important to realize that Chuck Schumer has bought and paid for Phil Bredesen's vote. And he is someone who has said, Bredesen has said, he would have voted against the tax cuts. We know when he was governor that he gave driving certificates to illegal aliens. And if you've done that, then how are you going to be a different kind of Democrat and support building a wall and support banning sanctuary cities and support ending chain migration and do this with no amnesty? And you think about those issues. Those are one of the top issues for Tennesseans. Another thing, you look at the judges. We've got Democrats that won't even meet with Brett Kavanaugh. And we are hopeful he's going to be confirmed very soon and be on the Supreme Court. You also are looking at record numbers of judges that have been appointed to the federal bench, and whether it's the district court or the appeals court or the circuit courts. And people want to see those courts filled out. They want to see them functional, operational. People are sick of dysfunction in the U.S. Senate, and they are sick of it in the federal government. And they voted for Donald Trump to go drain that swamp and make the return government to of, by, and for the people, like Tennesseans did when we had that state income tax.
Supreme Court justices were one of the issues we heard most on the campaign trail in 2016. He's already put in Neil Gorsuch, who's been a home run. Yes. Brett Kavanaugh will be in that same mold. Assuming he's in before this election ends, I think it's important for people to understand it's not this Supreme Court vote, because neither you nor Phil Bredesen will vote on this one. It's the next one. And if, for example, you have another opening on the Supreme Court after this election
Right.
cycle, there's certainly no guarantee that Bill Bredesen, who doesn't have to answer to voters for 6 years, will stand up against Chuck Schumer and the rest of the Democrats, including
Right.
Democrats saying, sacrifice your seat so we can stop these people. The next fight will even be more bitter than this one.
You're exactly right, and it is conceivable that 2019, 2020, you will have another Supreme Court, and you know you're going to have other federal court vacancies. So this is a time for Tennesseans to think about that. If you want somebody who is going to be there to support these constitutional nominees to the federal court and the Supreme Court, and judges that are not going to legislate from the bench, judges that are going to abide by the rule of law, that are constructionists and constitutionalists, I am their candidate for the U.S. Senate.
Let's go in the Wayback Machine for a minute.
Okay.
Go back to Mississippi.
We're good
Go
in
back
that
to
Wayback
Mississippi.
Machine.
Tell us a little about your background, okay, growing up. Because a lot of people,
Sure.
they think of, Marsha Blackburn, Middle Tennessee Congresswoman and state senator, but there was a Marsha Blackburn before that.
There was a Marsha Wedgeworth who became Marsha Blackburn. Absolutely. And I grew up on a small farm in South Mississippi and went to school at Mississippi State. Went to school on a 4-H club scholarship. Very involved in my community. My family always said, I give back more than you take, leave things in better shape than you found them. And my dad sold oil field equipment supplies. My mother was a professional volunteer, as she called herself. And she was very involved with our lives, at school, at church, 4-H club, and those activities. I have a brother and a sister, and lots of cousins that were around in Mississippi, so we had a huge, big, extended family. As I said, always a lot of accountability.
I think
because
your
you were
area during
always
the hurricanes
around.
a few years ago got hit particularly hard.
It got particularly, it hit particularly hard, and we were right there to do our part to help and to stand up. My parents, my mom served on the Red Cross board in Mississippi for 50 years, and so they were very involved in helping neighbors and friends in that area. When I went to school at Mississippi State, I realized that my 4-H scholarship was not going to pay for everything I wanted to do in college. And my brother had this great job where he could earn as much money as he could get out there and work and earn. He got to work on straight commission, which sounded really good to me.
Yeah.
And it was a job selling books door to door. The company, the Southwestern Company, was headquartered in Nashville. And I wanted to do that job because I wanted the opportunity to make that kind of money. Well, when I asked my brother to recruit me, I found out there was only one problem. The company did not recruit women. They didn't have teams of women. So we worked a situation where they agreed to recruit me, but I would have to stay at home in Mississippi and sell, which I did my first summer. Earned $3,246.43, which was great, and I loved it. Big dollars in those days, Steve.
That was when tuition was around $1,000. I remember those days.
That's right. So you could pay for school and then go buy you a car. And then the next year, I recruited women from Mississippi State, and then went on to become a sales manager, one of the first female sales managers, of course. I helped to build a women's division at the Southwestern Company, and then married a bookseller from Texas named Chuck Blackburn. We actually met over at sales school here in Nashville, over at Belmont College, and we were registering for sales school. So we have been here in Williamson County, reared our children here. They both live in the area. We have 2 grandkids who are
We're not going to talk much about the
fantastic.
grandkids because you're a proud grandmother. You'll start bringing out pictures, and that won't play as well. But
I
if you
will
want to
bring
see
out
the
my
pictures,
phone
ask
and
Marsha
yes,
anytime. She'll
anytime.
be and recipes and cookies. So if you'll ask
That's
her at any
exactly
time.
right. I always have a trove of recipes and good healthy living advice.
With what you've done in the past with the women, is this year has been called in politics the year of the women, and you've seen women congressional candidates, you've seen women gubernatorial candidates
Yeah.
around the country, and obviously in the Senate. Is that still a breaking moment, a glass ceiling moment? Because I mean, when you broke things at Southwest, I mean, you didn't. There wasn't a glass ceiling. There was no ceiling. There was just a fence.
That's right.
Do you see that same impact that it will be helpful to you as a female candidate?
You know,
this time?
I've kind of seen that throughout my life. And it's always good to be breaking those barriers. And I refer to it as breaking barriers because I think you have to push those down before you can start to raise up and to encourage women to get out there and to take these steps has been very important to me. Whether it was something that was in the nonprofit sector or the private sector or certainly the public sector, to open those doors and to make ways for women. I always say, don't vote for me because I'm a female. Vote for me because I'm the most well-qualified person for the job.
Well, I think one of the things I've always admired about you is that you lead as a leader who happens to be a woman rather than a woman who's wanting to become a leader. And I think that's a distinction. Let's talk about a few issues.
Yeah.
The tariffs. We talked a little bit about global trade. Tennessee farmers are concerned, and again, that's your background, the soybean farmers especially, about getting their soybeans into China. President Trump, it looks like, has now opened the door with a concession in Europe to not only get our soybeans there, but perhaps start that dominoes falling of when a few countries decide, okay, no mas, we don't want to have a fight on this. That'll tend to sweep and we'll get to fairer, lower taxes. Tariffs are taxes, and if we have more access to foreign markets, that means taxes are lowered on our goods getting into those markets. That could be a big win for President Trump, but a bigger win for businesses and farmers.
Well, absolutely, it would be. And I was talking to a farmer yesterday up on the plateau, and we were talking about the soybeans issue. And the conversation was great. I always say I'm for freedom, free people, and free markets. And that was the basis of our conversation. And Steve, actually, it's the basis for the framework for when we talk about the tariff issue. And you're right about tariffs being harmful and hurtful to the process, and we don't want anything that is going to hurt Tennessee farmers, whether it's cotton, pork, soy, any of these exports. But this farmer yesterday said, you know, I just heard the president say they may be opening up the European Union and we might get more markets there. And he said, if we have to kind of work through this, he said, I'm kind of getting this now. He said, I'm really worried because we're all leveraged, and I totally get it, and I am worried right there with them every step of this way. And I have stayed in contact with the administration and with the Department of Commerce. I have stayed in contact with them every single day working on this issue, whether it is our chemical producers or our boat manufacturers, auto manufacturers, aftermarket auto parts, farm produce, soy items, cotton. We are very worried. There are 850,000 jobs in this state that are tied to trade. And 80% of the trade and exports are done by small to mid-sized businesses. That is significant.
But we could double that number if instead of Canada, for example, charging a 300% tax on dairy, instead of China charging a 100% tax on U.S.-made automobiles, we bring those down to what we're charging for out-of-country goods to come here, you get to a fair situation and our economy will boom. And that's what President Trump's trying to do.
That's right. And when I am talking to manufacturers, producers, and farmers, they say we want free and fair trade. That's what we want. We want stability. We want consistency. We want growing markets so that as we get better yields, we're going to get better prices from those yields.
One last issue question, opioids. You've been attacked and criticized by, there was a 60 Minutes piece by a guy who was selling a book, who was a whistleblower, and yet there hasn't been any definitive answer from the government as to whether this regulation is actually harming things, producing things, and it's not Congress. And by the way, I think that bill passed unanimously by both Democrats and Republicans, and President Obama signed it, so it's not like this was a tight, contentious issue.
No, the DEA wrote the language for the change that they wanted, submitted it. Every Democrat and Republican in both the House and the Senate did this. It was a 3-year process. Senators Whitehouse and Hatch led it in the Senate. It did come through my committee. And, you know, Steve, one of the things, the first letter I wrote on opioids to HHS and DEA, DOJ was in 2012. Saying there is an epidemic afoot and we are losing 30,000 people a year. We're now losing 60,000 people a year.
And part of your issue was trying to, on one hand, regulate it so that you don't have these big pill mills that are just dispensing it like candy. But on the same time, if you've got somebody that needs the access, they ought to be able to get
cancer
access to the
patients,
drugs.
hospice, and making certain we do this the right way so that pills do not get into the hands of people that are going to misuse them. We have worked tirelessly to clean up the regulation around opioids and these antipsychotic drugs, the things that are addictive. And Senator Portman and I are leading the effort on the Comprehensive Addiction Recovery Act 2.0. It is more resources for local law enforcement. It is resources for pregnant women with opioid addicted babies, which to me as a mother, this is one of the saddest situations. It is so heartbreaking, and I was so thrilled that Mrs. Trump came in this week to see the work that Vanderbilt is doing on
Yeah,
this
it's great
issue.
to have her come here.
Yeah.
Thank you again for being with us, Congresswoman Marsha Blackburn, running for the U.S. Senate. We're going to be doing this again during the next couple of months, heading to November. And stay tuned at Tennessee Star. We'll be covering the issues as well as doing the video interviews with candidates across the state in the upcoming months. I'm Steve Gill. This is the Tennessee Star Gill Report.